King Vorkul stood on a grand balcony of his palace, overlooking the mighty warships that hovered above the capital city of Zelrath. His empire was vast, his warriors feared across the stars. Yet, as he clenched his fists, his sharp claws digging into his palm, he felt only frustration. His daughter, Princess Syria, was a disgrace. Born into the proud Xilari race, she was expected to be strong, ruthless, and worthy of her bloodline. Yet from birth, Syria had been weak. Her body was frail, her spirit timid. Unlike her battle-hardened siblings, she had no thirst for war. While other young warriors trained in combat, Syria spent her time reading, observing, and worst of all, questioning the ways of their people. "This is unacceptable," Vorkul growled, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. His war council, a circle of scared and armored generals, stood in silence. None dared to speak against their king. Finally, one of them stepped forward. General Koreth, a veteran who had crushed entire rebellions with his bare hands, bowed slightly. "My king, if the princess cannot be strong here, perhaps she must be tested elsewhere." Vorkul's piercing yellow eyes narrowed. "Explain." Koreth smirked. "Send her to Kravos Ix." The room fell silent. Even the most hardened warriors knew that Kravos Ix was no place for the weak. It was a brutal colony world, filled with hostile wildlife, ruthless warriors, and endless war games designed to weed out the unfit. Many young warriors trained there, but only the strongest survived. Vorkul considered the idea. If Syria failed, it would confirm what he already believed. She was unworthy. If, by some miracle, she survived, she would return stronger. Either way, he would no longer have to bear the shame of her weakness. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Very well," he declared. "Send her to Kravos Ix. But to make things interesting," he paused, enjoying the suspense, "she will be given only one protector, a human." A murmur rippled through the council. The Xilari viewed humans as an insignificant species, weak, fragile, and unimpressive. While humanity had proven themselves intelligent and resourceful, they lacked the raw power of the Xilari. Sending a single human to guard Syria was the same as sending her alone. The decision was made. Syria stood in silence as the royal attendants packed her belongings. She had no choice in this matter. Her father had barely spoken to her when he delivered the news. "You will either return as a warrior or not return at all." Those were his exact words. She clenched her fists. She knew she was a disappointment to him. No matter how hard she tried, she was never strong enough, never fierce enough. The truth was, she did not want war. She wanted to understand the universe, not conquer it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned and saw a figure enter her chambers. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing green eyes. His uniform was different from the armored Xilari warriors she was used to. He wore a simple black combat suit, a belt filled with strange tools, and a confident expression. Syria frowned. "Who are you?" The man crossed his arms and gave her a small nod. "Captain David Carter, Terran Marine. I've been assigned as your bodyguard." Syria's eyes widened. A human. She had seen humans before, of course. The Xilari Empire had many species under its rule, and humans were among them. But they were not warriors. They were strategists, engineers, traders. Her father must have chosen this man as a final insult. She folded her arms. "I don't need a human to protect me." David raised an eyebrow. "Good, because I'm not here to protect you." Syria blinked. "What?" David smirked. "Your father sent me to guard you, but I know the truth. He expects you to fail. He expects you to break." His eyes locked onto hers. "But I don't train failures." Syria felt a flash of anger. "I didn't ask for your training." David shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The moment we land on Kravos Ix, you'll either learn to survive, or you won't. Your father thinks I'm a joke. That's fine. But if you listen to me, I might just prove him wrong. Syria wanted to argue, but something about David's confidence unsettled her. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't even afraid of her father. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't treating her as a lost cause. A strange feeling stirred in her chest. Was it annoyance? Or was it something else? She didn't know yet. But one thing was certain. This human was not what she expected. And Krivos AX was going to change everything. The transport ship rattled as it entered the storm-filled atmosphere of Krivos AX. Dark clouds swirled outside the thick windows, lightning flashing across the sky. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Prepare for landing. Conditions are unstable. Keep your weapons ready. Princess Syria sat stiffly in her seat, gripping the armrests. Across from her, Captain David Carter sat with his arms crossed, looking completely relaxed. His calm attitude irritated her. How could he be so unworried? The ship landed with a rough jolt. The doors hissed open, revealing a barren landscape of jagged rocks, twisted trees, and distant mountains. The air smelled of metal and damp earth. In the distance, strange howls echoed. David stood and stretched. Welcome to Krivos IX. Hope you like the smell of danger. Syria narrowed her eyes. You act like this is a game. David smirked. It's only a game if you don't take it seriously. If you do, it's a fight for survival. And trust me, I take survival very seriously. Syria stepped outside, pulling her cloak tightly around her. The auxiliary outpost stood ahead. A collection of steel structures, reinforced walls, and training arenas filled with warriors sparring with brutal efficiency. Nearby, massive war beasts roamed in enclosures, their sharp fangs glinting under the gray sky. A group of Silari warriors turned as they saw her. Some chuckled. Others whispered, "The weak princess has arrived. She won't last a week." Syria clenched her jaw, but said nothing. She had heard these words all her life. David, however, grinned. Good. Let them talk. It won't matter soon. Syria shot him a glare. Why? David started walking toward the barracks. Because you're going to prove them wrong. That night, Syria lay on a hard cot in a dimly lit barracks. The howls of alien predators echoed in the distance, mixing with the sounds of warriors training even after dark. Sleep didn't come easily. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the bed. She jolted awake, finding David standing over her, a large pack in his hand. "Get up," he said. Syria groaned. It's the middle of the night. David tossed the pack onto the floor. The enemy won't wait for morning. She scowled. I need sleep. David crouched down, his green eyes sharp. Sleep is a reward, not a right. You think those warriors out there respect you. They don't. You think your father believes in you. He doesn't. If you want to prove them wrong, you need to train. Now, get up. Syria glared at him, but something in his voice made her hesitate. No one had ever spoken to her like this, not with cruelty, but with challenge, as if he actually expected something from her. She sat up slowly. Fine. The training grounds were cold. The air smelled of sweat, metal, and dust. A few warriors still trained in the distance, but most were asleep. David led her to an empty section, where a set of weapons were laid out. Syria reached for a sleek Silari blade, but David shook his head and tossed her a simple wooden staff. She frowned. This is a child's weapon. David twirled his own staff with ease. If you can't handle a stick, you won't survive with a blade. She gritted her teeth but took her stance. Fine. Show me. David moved fast. Too fast. Before she could react, his staff struck her side, knocking her off balance. Pain jolted through her ribs. She gasped. That was... Whack! His staff hit her leg. She collapsed onto one knee. Too slow, he said. Anger flared inside her. She pushed herself up and swung at him, but he dodged easily. Whack! Another hit, this time to her arm. Syria let out a frustrated growl. "You're cheating." David stopped, resting the staff on his shoulder. "No, I'm just better." Syria's fists clenched. She had always known she was weak, but hearing it like this, it hurt. David crouched down in front of her. "You have two choices, princess. You can stay angry and keep losing, or you can learn and start winning." Syria swallowed hard. Her pride burned, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had spent too long avoiding pain, avoiding struggle. Maybe it was time to face it. She took a deep breath. Again. David grinned. "Now we're getting somewhere." Over the next week, training became relentless. David pushed her beyond what she thought possible. He made her run miles through rough terrain, spar against him until her arms ached, and train with weights that made her muscles burn. Syria failed. Again and again. She fell. She bled. But David never let her stop. Each time she hit the ground, he made her get up. Each time she failed, he forced her to try again. And slowly, something changed. Her movements became sharper. Her mind, once clouded by self-doubt, began to focus. She learned how to anticipate attacks, how to use her smaller frame to her advantage. She was still weaker than him, still slower. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't losing because she was weak. She was losing because she was learning. And one night, as David swung his staff at her, she finally saw it coming. She dodged. And for the first time, she struck back. The wooden staff hit his shoulder. Not hard. Not enough to truly hurt, but enough for him to pause. Syria stood there, breathing heavily, staring at him. David grinned. Not bad. Syria exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Hope. The sun hung low over Kravozax, casting long shadows across the rocky battlefield. The air smelled of dust and sweat, and the distant howls of predators echoed through the valley. The warriors of the Scifi training outpost gathered in a rough circle, their eyes filled with amusement and curiosity. Today, the weak princess was about to fight. Syria gripped her training sword, her palms slick with sweat. She had spent weeks under David's relentless training, and her body still ached from the countless bruises and falls. But today wasn't another training session. Today was a test. Her opponent, a towering Scifi warrior named Roken, cracked his knuckles and grinned. His sharp fangs glinted in the fading sunlight. "This will be quick, princess," he sneered. "Try not to embarrass yourself." The warriors around them chuckled. None of them expected her to last more than a few seconds. Syria had seen them fight. Fierce, brutal, merciless. She knew how strong they were. She also knew something they didn't. David leaned against a nearby crate, watching with crossed arms. He met Syria's eyes and gave her a small nod. "Trust what you've learned. Fight smart." Syria tightened her grip. She had no raw strength like Roken, no natural brutality like the others. But she had David's lessons, and those lessons had taught her one thing above all. Strength alone doesn't win battles. The signal was given. The fight began. Roken lunged, swinging his heavy blade in a wide arc. Syria barely dodged in time, feeling the wind of his strike rush past her face. She stumbled back, adjusting her stance. Roken laughed. Pathetic. He swung again. This time, she didn't retreat. Instead, she sidestepped at the last second, letting his momentum carry him forward. Then she struck, aiming low. Her wooden sword slammed into the back of his knee. Roken grunted in pain, staggering slightly. A small hit, but a hit nonetheless. The crowd murmured. Roken's grin faded, replaced by irritation. "You got lucky." He attacked again, faster this time. Syria dodged, ducked, moved just outside his reach. She wasn't winning through power. She was winning through speed, precision, and patience. Roken grew angrier, his swings becoming reckless. David had warned her about this. A frustrated enemy makes mistakes. Use them. She waited. Let him tire himself out. Let his anger blind him. Then she saw her moment. Roken swung too wide, leaving his side open. Syria lunged forward, slamming the hilt of her sword into his ribs. He let out a sharp gasp, staggering back. Silence fell over the watching warriors. Syria didn't hesitate. She spun, slashing across his leg, then followed with a strike to his arm. Roken dropped his weapon. The fight was over. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a deep voice broke the silence. "Well done." Syria turned to see David nodding, the hint of a proud smile on his face. The warriors around them looked at each other, murmuring. This was not what they had expected. The weak princess had won. Roken gritted his teeth, but instead of anger, there was something else in his eyes. Respect. He picked up his sword and gave her a stiff nod before walking away. Syria stood there, heart pounding. She had fought. She had won. And for the first time in her life, she belonged. That night, as Syria sat by the barracks, staring up at the alien stars, David sat down beside her. "You did good today," he said. She exhaled. "I won." David chuckled. "You didn't just win. You proved them wrong." Syria looked at him, a question forming in her mind. "Why did you train me? You could have just followed my father's orders and let me fail." David was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "Because I don't believe in fate. I believe in effort. I saw someone who wanted to change, and I knew you could." Syria thought about that. All her life, she had been told she was weak, that she would never be more than a disappointment. But David had never seen her that way. He had never treated her as fragile. He had treated her as capable. And now, for the first time, she believed it too. Far away, in the royal palace, King Vorkal received a report of the fight. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he set the report down and muttered to himself. Interesting. The morning air on Kravos AX was thick with mist, rolling over the jagged cliffs and dense forests. The training outpost was alive with activity as warriors sharpened their blades, ran drills, and prepared for the next challenge. Syria tightened the straps on her armor, her muscles still sore from yesterday's fight. She had won against Roken, but that was just the beginning. Now, the real test was ahead. David stood beside her, adjusting his gear. "Today's going to be different," he said. Syria glanced at him. "How different?" He smirked. "Less fighting, more surviving." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Before David could answer, General Korath, one of her father's most trusted commanders, stepped onto the training platform. His armor gleamed in the morning light, his expression cold and unreadable. "Warriors," Korath's voice boomed. "Today, you will prove your worth through the hunt." The gathered warriors tensed. The hunt was a brutal trial designed to test survival skills, teamwork, and strength. The challenge was simple. Each warrior would be sent into the wildlands of Kravos EX, given only basic supplies. Their goal: track and kill a Ravager. Syria's heart clenched at the name. Ravagers were massive, reptilian beasts with razor-sharp claws and armored hides. They were known for their aggression and speed, and even experienced warriors struggled to bring them down. Korath's yellow eyes scanned the group. "You will be assigned partners. The first team to return with proof of their kill will be honored. The ones who fail will be remembered as weak." His gaze lingered on Syria for a moment before moving on. Syria already knew what people were thinking. The weak princess will fail. She clenched her fists. Not this time. David leaned close. "Looks like we're partners." Syria raised an eyebrow. "They paired me with a human." David smirked. "No, I chose to be your partner." Syria blinked. "Why?" David's smile faded slightly. "Because I know you can do this." A warmth spread through her chest, but she pushed it down. Now was not the time for emotions. Korath raised his hand. The hunt begins now. The warriors scattered into the wilderness. The forest was dense, filled with twisted trees and thick vines. Syria and David moved carefully through the underbrush, their steps quiet. Every sound could mean danger. David crouched beside a large footprint in the mud. Ravager tracks. Fresh. Syria knelt beside him, studying the deep claw marks. It's close. David nodded. All right. What's the plan? Syria hesitated. She wasn't used to leading. But if she wanted to prove herself, she had to start making decisions. She exhaled. We track it from a distance. Look for weaknesses before attacking. David grinned. Smart. Let's move. They followed the tracks deeper into the forest, moving with caution. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Blood. Syria tensed. Do you smell that? David nodded. Yeah. And I hear something too. A low growl echoed through the trees. Slowly they crept forward, pushing past a wall of vines. Then they saw it. A massive ravager stood in a clearing, its dark scales glistening in the light. Blood dripped from its jaws. It had just made a kill. The carcass of a smaller creature lay at its feet. Syria swallowed hard. The beast was even bigger than she imagined. David studied it. All right, princess, how do we take it down? Syria gripped her weapon, thinking. A direct attack was suicide. The ravager was too strong. They needed a plan. She looked around. The terrain was uneven, with large boulders and thick roots. A strategy formed in her mind. She turned to David. We lead it into a trap. David raised an eyebrow. I like where this is going. Syria pointed to a narrow passage between two rocks. We lure it through there. I'll attack from the front and distract it. You climb above and drop onto its back. Its weak spot is the neck. David grinned. Now that's a plan. Syria exhaled, steadying herself. Time to prove I can do this. She stepped into the clearing, sword raised. The ravager's yellow eyes locked onto her. It let out a deafening roar in charge. Syria's heart pounded, but she didn't run. She stood her ground, waiting for the right moment. The ravager lunged. At the last second, she dodged, slashing at its side. The blade barely pierced its tough hide, but it was enough to make the beast furious. Come on, ugly, she muttered, backing toward the narrow passage. The ravager roared and followed. Above, David crouched on a rock ledge, waiting for his chance. Syria ran through the gap. The beast chased after her, squeezing between the boulders. Now, David, she shouted. David leaped. He landed on the ravager's back, driving his knife deep into its neck. The beast screeched, thrashing wildly. Syria didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, driving her blade into the same wound. The ravager let out one final roar before collapsing. Silence. Syria and David stood over the fallen creature, breathing heavily. Then, slowly, Syria smiled. We did it. David grinned. Not bad, princess. She looked at him, feeling something new, pride. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. Back at the outpost, warriors stared as Syria and David returned, carrying proof of their kill. Korat's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The weak princess had succeeded. And far away, in the royal palace, King Vorkal received another report. He read it in silence. Then, for the first time, he felt something unexpected. Doubt. Maybe his daughter wasn't as weak as he thought. The warriors of the Tsilari training outpost gathered in the main hall, their voices buzzing with excitement. The hunt had ended, and Syria and David had returned victorious. Syria sat at a long table, staring at the food before her. Meat roasted over open flames, thick soups filled heavy bowls, and exotic fruits gleamed under the torchlight. It was a feast in honor of the warriors who had proven themselves. And tonight, she was among them. David nudged her elbow. You should eat. You earned it. Syria hesitated. The warriors around her, The same ones who had once mocked her were now looking at her differently, some with respect, some with curiosity, and some with anger. Roken sat a few seats away, his expression unreadable. The warrior she had defeated in battle had barely spoken to her since her victory. Syria picked up a piece of fruit, but before she could eat, General Korath stood. The hall fell silent. "The hunt has ended," Korath announced. His sharp eyes swept over the gathered warriors. Some proved themselves worthy. Some failed. A few warriors shifted uncomfortably. Korath's gaze landed on Syria. And some were unexpected. Syria felt the weight of his words. The general took a slow step forward. "The weak princess killed a ravager." Impressive. His voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it. David tensed beside her. He didn't like Korath. Syria could see it in his eyes. "She did not do it alone," Korath continued. His gaze flicked to David. She had a human at her side. A murmur spread through the hall. Syria clenched her fists. She knew what Korath was doing. He wasn't praising her. He was challenging her. David smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Last time I checked, the hunt didn't say anything about fighting alone." Korath's lips curled slightly. "Perhaps, but warriors must rely on their own strength. If the princess cannot stand without a human, then she is still weak." The warriors watched, waiting for Syria to speak. Syria stood slowly. She met Korath's gaze without flinching. "I killed a ravager," she said, her voice steady. "With or without David, I proved myself." Korath's expression didn't change. Syria took a step forward. "Unless you want to fight me and test it yourself." The hall went dead silent. For a long moment, Korath didn't move. Then he let out a small chuckle. "Not tonight, princess." He turned, walking away. But Syria knew this wasn't over. That night, Syria stood outside the barracks, looking up at the alien stars. The cool wind brushed against her face. David leaned against the wall beside her. "Korath doesn't like you." Syria let out a short laugh. "You noticed." David crossed his arms. "He sees you as a threat now. That makes him dangerous." She exhaled. "He won't attack me openly. Not yet." David looked at her. "So what's his next move?" Syria thought for a moment. Korath was ruthless, but he was also careful. He wouldn't risk breaking the rules. Not unless he was sure he could win. "He'll wait," she said. "He'll watch, and when he sees an opportunity, he'll strike." David nodded. "Then we have to be ready." Before Syria could respond, a voice interrupted them. "You have a message." Syria turned. A young warrior handed her a sealed datapad. She took it carefully. "Who is it from?" The warrior hesitated. "Your father." David stiffened. Syria's chest tightened. She hadn't heard from her father since she left the palace. Slowly, she pressed her thumb against the seal. The screen flickered to life, and the deep, commanding voice of King Vor-Kel filled the air. "Syria, your progress is noted. Return to the palace. It is time we speak." The message ended. David raised an eyebrow. That didn't sound like a request. Syria stared at the blank screen. No, it didn't. The next morning, Syria prepared to leave. A royal transport had arrived, sleek and black, its engines humming softly. Warriors gathered to watch, some whispering, others staring in silence. Roken approached her. "So you're leaving." Syria tightened the straps on her armor. "For now." Roken studied her. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "You earned respect, even from those who won't admit it." Syria met his gaze. "And you?" Roken smirked. "You beat me in a fair fight. That's enough." He stepped back. David walked up, carrying his pack. "Hope you weren't planning on going alone," he said. Syria blinked. "You're coming." David grinned. "What? And miss all the fun?" She smiled slightly. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone. As they boarded the transport, Korath watched from the shadows. He turned to a nearby warrior. "Follow them. Report back to me." The warrior nodded and slipped away. Korath's eyes narrowed as he watched the transport rise into the sky. The weak princess was becoming a problem, and problems needed to be eliminated. The royal transport soared through the atmosphere of Kravos Ax, leaving behind the training outpost. Inside, Syria sat quietly, staring at the glowing city below as they approached the capital. Towering spires reached into the sky, their dark metal reflecting the light from the twin moons. David sat across from her, his arms crossed. "So, what do you think your father wants?" Syria exhaled. "I don't know, but it's not just a conversation." David nodded. "Yeah, the way that message sounded, he's testing you." Syria already knew that. Her father, King Vorkal, was not a man who gave second chances. He had sent her to the outpost expecting her to fail. But now that she had proven herself, he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. The transport slowed as it entered the royal docking bay. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. Syria stepped out first, her boots clicking against the polished floor. David followed close behind, his hand resting near his belt, ready for anything. A line of royal guards stood in formation, their silver armor gleaming. At the center of the hall, standing tall and imposing, was King Vorkal, his dark cape draped over his broad shoulders, his golden eyes studying Syria like a scientist examining an experiment. "Syria," he said, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. Syria bowed her head slightly. "Father." His gaze flicked to David. "And the human." David gave a small smirk. "That's me." The guards tensed, but Vorkal only let out a quiet hum. He turned, walking toward the grand hall. "Come." Syria and David followed. The throne room was massive, with high ceilings and banners displaying the royal crest. Syria stood before the throne, her father towering above her. "You have returned with victory," Vorkal said. "I did not expect this." Syria kept her posture firm. "You sent me away to fail." The king's expression remained unreadable. "I sent you away to learn." Syria clenched her fists. "And I did." Vorkal studied her for a long moment. Then he gestured to a side door. "Walk with me." She hesitated but followed. David started to move, but a guard stepped in front of him. Vorkal glanced back. "The human stays here." Syria looked at David. He gave her a slight nod. "Go." She turned and followed her father. The private corridor was silent except for their footsteps. Massive windows overlooked the city, where thousands of warriors trained below. Vorkal finally spoke. "I once thought you weak." Syria didn't answer. "I see now that I was wrong," he continued. "But strength is not enough." Syria frowned. "Then what is?" The king stopped walking. He turned to face her. "Loyalty." She stiffened. Vorkal's gaze was sharp. "You have improved. You fight well. But your loyalty is unclear." Syria felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Her father's voice was calm, but firm. "You have spent too much time with the human." Syria's heart pounded. "David is my ally." Vorkal's expression darkened. "He is an outsider." Syria stepped forward. "He helped me become stronger. He taught me things no one else did." The king's eyes narrowed. "And now you defend him over your own people." Syria opened her mouth, then stopped. This is what he wanted. He was testing her. She exhaled. "I am loyal to my people, but I will not abandon those who stand by me." Vorkal studied her in silence. Then he turned away. "We shall see." He walked toward the balcony. Below, warriors trained in formation, their weapons clashing in the cold air. "There is a battle coming," Vorkal said. "Enemies rise on the borders. The empire will be tested." Syria stood beside him. "Then let me fight." Her father turned his golden eyes on her. "You wish to prove yourself." She nodded. "Yes." The king was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You will lead a mission. A test of command. Syria straightened. What mission? Vorkal's voice was low. Eliminate a human outpost. Syria froze. Her breath caught in her throat. What? Her father looked at her. Humans have taken land on our borders. They refuse to leave. They must be dealt with. Syria's mind raced. Humans? She knew her people fought many wars. But she had never thought she would be sent to destroy humans, David's people. Vorkal watched her closely. Will you hesitate? Syria forced herself to stand tall. I will complete the mission. The king nodded. Then go. Do not fail me. Syria turned, her step steady, but inside, her heart was in chaos. She walked back into the throne room. David stood waiting. What happened? Syria took a deep breath. We have a mission. David's eyes narrowed. What kind of mission? She hesitated. Then she said, We're attacking the human outpost. David's face darkened. For the first time, Syria saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Doubt. And for the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Fear. Syria stood at the edge of the royal warship's command deck, staring at the swirling lights of hyperspace. Her heart was heavy, her thoughts tangled in confusion. The mission was clear. Lead an attack on the human outpost. Prove her loyalty. Earn her father's trust. But how could she do that when David, her closest ally, the one who had stood by her side, was human? She clenched her fists. David stood near the viewport, arms crossed. You're really going through with this? His voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. Syria turned to face him. I don't have a choice. David scoffed. There's always a choice. Syria felt frustration rise in her chest. You don't understand. If I refuse, I lose everything. David stepped closer. And if you go through with it, what do you gain? Respect from people who never believed in you. Approval from a father who sent you away to fail. Syria flinched. She hated that his words made sense. The door to the command deck slid open, and Rokan entered, his armor gleaming under the dim lights. We've arrived, he said. The human outpost is within range. Syria swallowed hard. Prepare for deployment. Rokan nodded and left. David watched her carefully. You don't want to do this. Syria didn't answer, because deep inside, she knew he was right. The warship hovered over the barren planet below. The human outpost was small, a collection of metal buildings surrounded by a weak energy shield. It was not a military base. It was a colony. Syria's stomach twisted. These weren't enemy soldiers. These were civilians. Families. Children. Her father hadn't told her that. She stood at the deployment bay, her warriors waiting for her command. The assault ships were ready. The weapons were primed. All she had to do was give the order. Her hands trembled. David stepped beside her, his voice low. You know this isn't right. Syria looked at him. What do I do? She whispered. David exhaled. You already know the answer. Her mind raced. If she refused, she would be branded a traitor. She would lose her place, her people, her father's trust. But if she attacked, she would lose herself. Her heart pounded. Then she made her choice. Syria stepped forward. The human outpost is unarmed, she announced, her voice strong. They are not a threat. Rokan frowned. The king gave us orders. I am the commander of this mission. Syria interrupted. And I say we do not attack. Murmurs spread through the warriors. Rokan stepped closer, his voice low. If you disobey the king, you will be seen as a traitor. Syria met his gaze. So be it. Silence filled the bay. Then Rokan smirked. Himph. I wondered if you had the strength to stand against him. Syria blinked. You agree with me? Rokan nodded. Not all of us follow blindly. He turned to the warriors. We stand with our commander. Syria's chest tightened with relief. David let out a breath. Well, that was easier than I thought. Syria shot him a look. Then the alarms blared. A deep voice echoed through the warship's comm system. Syria. Her father. King Vorkal's voice was calm, but filled with warning. You dare disobey me. Syria stepped forward. This is not war. This is a massacre. The silence stretched. Then, the king's voice turned cold. You have made your choice. The ship trembled as the engines powered down. The command panel flickered. They were being locked out. They're shutting down the ship, David muttered. Syria's heart pounded. He's not going to let us leave. Roken clenched his jaw. Then we fight our way out. Syria turned to the warriors. Anyone who wishes to stay, stay. But I will not be a part of this. One by one, the warriors stepped forward. They would stand with her. Syria took a deep breath. Then let's get out of here. Fighting their way through the warship was brutal. The royal guards were strong, but Syria's warriors fought harder. They moved swiftly, cutting through enemy lines, making their way to the escape shuttles. David covered Syria's back as they ran through the halls. This is insane. Syria gritted her teeth. Welcome to my life. Explosions rocked the ship as they reached the hangar. The doors loomed ahead, the escape shuttles waiting. Then, Korath stepped into their path. The general's eyes burned with fury. You are a disgrace, Syria. Syria tightened her grip on her weapon. Then stop me. Korath lunged. Their blades clashed in a furious storm. Syria ducked, spun, struck, but Korath was strong. He knocked her back, raising his blade for the final blow. A shot rang out. Korath stumbled. Blood spread across his armor. David lowered his blaster. Yeah, you're not killing her today. Syria didn't hesitate. She grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the shuttle. The doors sealed behind them as they launched into space. They had escaped. The shuttle soared through the stars, leaving the Empire behind. Syria sat in silence, staring out the window. She had defied her father, turned against her own people. She was no longer a princess. She was a fugitive. David sat beside her. So, what now? Syria exhaled. Now, she said, we find a new path. David smirked. Well, whatever it is, I'm with you. Syria looked at him. For the first time in her life, she felt free. And she was ready for whatever came next. The weak princess was gone. The warrior had risen. And her true journey was just beginning.